What seems to be hell on earth, yet a blessing in disguise. The life of a child who has been through what he would like to think of as a little piece of hell on earth, who is trying to figure out what could possibly happen next in his life. While growing up, he has experienced life as a place of loss, pain, and distress. But though everything he has encountered, he has learned that although these things have happened, life has still been good to him. Here goes his life in a little more detail. When Brian was just starting school, everything was great. He was just like everyone else he was going to school with. He was a little spoiled because he was his mother's youngest child at the time. He enjoyed going to school and learning something new every day. Brian knew that getting good grades would make his mom smile. He also knew that by getting good grades, his mom would allow him to get his way as well. With Brian's 7th birthday exactly 2 months away, he starts to make his birthday list, because April 3rd was coming fast, and he knew if he made his list early, he would definitely get everything on it. Then one day, later on that month, Brian's life changed a little bit because his mom added a new face to the family. She had a baby girl on the day before Valentine's. Brian didn't know whether to be happy or mad that day. He didn't really know how to feel because he was unsure if his mom would treat him differently and stop loving him as much. Or should he be happy that he was going to be a big brother? Although he had all these mixed feelings, when his mom and little sister were released from the hospital, things were great. Brian played with his sister, and he loved her to death. He actually would get upset if he couldn't play, feed, or hold her when he wanted. February 24th, 2002 is a day that Brian will never be able to forget because it was an unforgettable moment. What happened that day? Brian, wake up. Mom isn't breathing, said Brian's older brother, while shaking him, trying to wake him up to see what was going on. But Brian didn't believe him and went on to say, "Leave me alone, James. Let me go back to sleep. Why would you play like that anyway?" James, now frustrated with Brian, finally said, "If you don't believe me, get up and go see for yourself. They have the ambulance outside, and they're working on Mom right now, trying to get her to breathe again." Finally, Brian got up and went to see for himself what was going on. When he turned the corner, he immediately began to cry. Because that was all he could do when he seen his mother laid across her bed, lifeless. There were people running around frantically around the house trying to help his mom. There were plastic bags and paper wrappings all over the place from them working on her. Then all of a sudden, the people brought a stretcher and placed Brian's mom on it to take her to the hospital. At this point, all Brian could do was fall to the floor, sobbing because of everything that he had just seen that had taken place. He didn't tell her he loved her before she was taken away, not knowing whether or not that would be his last time seeing her. Later on that night, more of Brian's family came to the house to comfort him, as well as waiting on the phone call to see what was going on. By this time, Brian had stopped crying for the most part and talking to his family members. Shockingly, Brian started comforting others who was crying. He also looks at his grandmother and tells her, "Grandma, please stop crying. Everything is going to be okay." Finally, she begins to stop crying, and the next thing you know, the phone rings. Ring, ring, ring. There goes the phone ringing. The one phone call that everyone had been waiting on was finally there. But now that it was ringing, no one wanted to answer the phone because they were afraid of what they were going to hear once they picked up the phone. Finally, one of Brian's uncles picked up the phone, only to drop it moments later. The news that he had heard and just received would change his life and everyone's life that was in the room. For the next couple of minutes, the entire room was silent. Everyone waited to see what Brian's uncle had to say. Finally, he began to open his mouth, and before saying anything, he began to cry. After wiping the tears from his eyes, he said, "The doctor said that she died on the way to the hospital. They had spent the last half hour trying to bring her back, but there was nothing they could do to bring her back." After we had the funeral, there were all kinds of emotions in the air. People didn't know whether they were coming or going. Brian had lost the most important person in his life, and he didn't know what else to do with himself. On top of that, he had lost his little sister. After their mom passed, they were separated because they had different dads. And she wasn't allowed to stay with her dad, so she went to live with their aunt and uncle. And he went to live with his biological father, according to the state, that is. He was just full of anger and sadness. At this point, nothing seemed to matter to him. In a short period of time, he went from being the kid who loved everyone and everything and became a person who hated everyone and everything. When Brian first moved with Calvin, his biological dad, according to the state, things seemed like they could be okay. Calvin seemed as though he was excited to have Brian come to live with him and his girlfriend at the time. This didn't last very long, though. Brian realized that life here was not going to be peaches and cream. Calvin would allow Brian to drink alcohol with him and his girlfriend while playing board games with them. He also would give Brian alcohol when he was sick and say, "It's not going to hurt you. If anything, it's going to help you out by cleaning out your system." This is his way of giving Brian cough medicine for him to get better at 6 years old. As Brian got older, the drinking increased for him and Calvin as well. This only brought about more pain for Brian. It actually had gotten so bad that Brian didn't wash the dishes before he got into the pool. Calvin would take a kitchen knife and throw it at him, barely missing Brian with it, and yelling, "Didn't I tell you to wash the dishes before you go outside and get in the pool? I bet if one of those kitchen knives cut you, you'll remember to do what I told you." And all Brian could do was cry, because he never thought that would happen to him. Although he had been beaten time and time again. So after that, Brian tried to do everything right around the house. He washed the dishes as well, and before he asked to do anything. For a while, things started to get a little better, and Brian was doing well in school again. He was starting to make friends, and his teachers were starting to give him a chance. Calvin had stopped drinking as much, and the beatings had gotten better. So life was going good for Brian, or at least he thought. As soon as Brian had become comfortable with Calvin and was giving him a chance, Calvin messed it up in a way that could never be fixed. One day, Brian went to school and got in trouble for something as simple as not raising his hand in class to answer a question, and he lost a star for it, and he had to tell his parents about it on a daily basis. So when Brian got home from school that day, he was nervous, but he told Calvin about his day. In Calvin's response, he said, "Okay, Brian, I'm not even going to get mad. Just go to your room and don't come out for anything but to eat and go to the bathroom." So that's what Brian did. Later that night, Brian went to sleep because he didn't have anything else to do, because he was being punished for what he had done earlier that day. After a while, Brian wakes up to loud thuds and voices yelling at one another, and it's Calvin and his girlfriend who seem to be fighting with each other, because Calvin is coming in the room to kill Brian with a machete that they used to cut bushes when they went fishing. For Brian, this was the last straw. He didn't know what to do anymore. But what he did know was that he couldn't trust Calvin, and that somehow he had to get away from this man before he was killed by him. So Brian finally takes matters into his own hands and does everything that he possibly can to reach his aunt and uncle who his sister lives with. Because he knows that there has to be a better life out there for him to live. This can't be all that life has to offer him. During Brian's process of trying to move with his aunt and uncle, and he ran into a conflict with Calvin, but this time Brian wasn't having it. He was tired of being beat by Calvin and just sitting there taking it. Calvin went to hit Brian, and at the same time, Brian was getting ready to hit Calvin with a blow of his own. When Calvin saw this, it stopped him in his tracks. He then went on to ask, "Who do you think you are, drawing back your hands to hit me like you're grown?" Brian replied saying, "You're about to hit me like I was grown, so I was going to hit you like I was grown." After Brian said this, Calvin walked off to pick up the phone and call the cops on Brian. But then he hung up because he realized he would be getting himself into trouble in the long run, because all Brian had to do was tell the cops how Calvin had been treating him. A couple years later, Brian was with his aunt and uncle, who were very loving and cared deeply about Brian and his well-being. And they treat him with respect, but they also demand respect from Brian. So while things are going much smoother for Brian, he is beginning to realize that things that he went through up until this point in his life were all placed there to help him become a better person. He realized that all the pain and suffering that he had encountered was only to help him in the long run. Because now Brian is onto playing sports. And with sports, he comes a lot of brutality and pain. You have to suck it up and keep going. And the difference is now he's able to be the hammer instead of being the nail. And all the pain gives him strength to go on every day and helps him when he wants to quit. It all allows him to know how he should and should not act. Now Brian can live to tell a story for a kid who at one point lost the only thing he knew and went through all that he went through to be able to stand tall and say, when life seems to be a little piece of hell, it is only burning you to make you and mold you into a beautiful sculpture. You stand tall for everyone can see that no matter what the past holds, it doesn't have to have an effect on what your future could be.